So we wrote it a couple of years ago with a few close friends and colleagues, and one thing we tried to do in that book was to take a good, hard, close look at the world of popular psychology. And one point we make is that not all pop psychology is bad. Some of it's actually quite good, but that the big problem is that as a field we often don't do a good job of distinguishing the parts of pop psychology that are grounded in good science and the parts that are grounded in bad science. So one thing we try to look at is to examine what we often call psychomythology, kind of the mythology of psychology, and try to identify 50 popular myths, misconceptions that a lot of well-educated people have about how the human mind works. I'm kind of a scientific nerd at heart, I have to admit. I've always loved science and the science of psychology. And I think one thing that drew me to this topic was the fact that as I got into psychology, I realized that there are so many things that lots of smart people and well-educated people, myself included, I have to say, when I was a psychology undergraduate, believe about human nature that just isn't true. And I came to realize that a lot of that stuff is things that we just don't typically address in our psychology classes. They're things we often ignore, but they're things that can lead us astray and can lead us to make, in some cases, bad real-world decisions. We typically try to look at the scientific literature. There are lots of studies bearing on each of these myths. On the case of the 10% of one's brain myth, for example, there are brain imaging studies that have looked at this question. Is it in fact true that 90% of the brain lies dormant? One example that a lot of people have is that the human brain is massively underutilized, that we typically only use 10% of our brain. Some people say 20%. Most typical figure is 10%. And I have to admit, on some mornings like this, where I've only had one cup of coffee, I sometimes feel that way. But in fact, we all use about 100% of our brains almost all of the time. And actually, even though it may seem like an innocuous myth, in many ways I think it actually causes problems, because a lot of people think, oh, well, if I could just use the other 90% of my brain, I'd be in great shape. So then people buy various products to try to synchronize their brain's hemispheres or ramp up their brain's activities or take stimulants, for example, under the assumption that they can only harness the other 90% of their brain activity, everything would be just fine. So there's a great example of a myth that may seem kind of harmless, but I think in the long run it actually ends up ripping people off. One reason, I think, is that our common sense often is wrong. I think what you see with a lot of these myths is they're kind of intuitive. So take, for example, again, this belief that memory works like a video camera or tape recorder. Subjectively, it kind of feels that way. It even feels that way to me. So I think oftentimes we make the mistake of thinking that seeing is believing, that we can always trust the raw data of our perceptions, but that's not the case. I think another big factor is we underestimate the extent to which our memories are imperfect and to which we often are selectively attending to things in our environment. So lots of people believe that there are more odd behaviors, more strange behaviors during full moons, even though the evidence suggests that that's not the case. That's another one of our 50 myths, a very prevalent myth, that people act strangely during full moons, much more so than at other times. Well, I think what ends up happening is people underestimate the extent to which when there's a full moon, they pay attention to the way people are acting. They remember it when people act strangely. They forget about all the times when there's a full moon and people do not act strangely. They forget about all the times when people act strangely when there's not a full moon. So I think that's one powerful factor. Some of these myths can lead us to make bad or questionable everyday life decisions. We believe that we can speed read, if we can increase our reading speeds by hundreds of times just by taking a really quick online course or buying a book that teaches us to speed read, well, we're going to get ripped off. We're going to purchase these courses or watch these internet videos that teach us how to speed read. Well, speed reading doesn't work. It's a rip-off. By the way, if people are curious, speed reading courses basically get you to skim. So, yeah, you'll, quote, read more quickly, but you're also going to comprehend a lot less. Again, another great example of where a lot of these beliefs are popular because we kind of want to believe them. If we believe, for example, that opposites tend to attract in romantic relationships, another one of our 50 myths, the evidence does not support that view. If anything, most of the data suggests that opposites tend to repel in most relationships. At the very best, they're not attracted to each other. If we believe that, we may go online on internet dating sites or try to meet people who are really different from us in our values, in our beliefs, and our attitudes. Bad idea, because in general, those are the very kinds of people who are not only going to be often not attracted to each other, but more importantly, are often going to repel in the long term in terms of relationships. Listen to your common sense intuitions, but don't be imprisoned by them. Realize that the reason science works is it helps us to sift out what aspects of our common sense are likely to be right and what aspects of our common sense are likely to be questionable or even false. So I think so often in society we're told, always trust your common sense. I think science teaches us something a bit different, which is that, yeah, common sense can be pretty good, and I use it all the time, too. I don't know how good my common sense is, but I try to use it. But when it comes to understanding how human nature works, how our brains work, how our minds work, we know common sense often isn't so good. And that's where psychological science, I think, comes in. It doesn't tell us that all common sense is wrong. It doesn't tell us that all pop psychology is wrong. But it does give us some guidance as to when we should listen to pop psychology, when we should listen to our intuitions, and when instead we should look at the data.